Well, welcome to our podcast. We are excited to have you along for this journey. My name is Madison, and I'm the Executive Director of Peace Restored. I'll be your host as we discuss mental health and faith in our podcast, Seeking Healing, Finding Hope, which is a production of Peace Restored, a 501c3 nonprofit located in Indiana, serving women everywhere. We're so glad to have you listening in again this week. Today, I also have joining with me Renee Roberts, our Assistant Director. I'm excited to have Renee join me as we continue to discuss boundaries. Last time on our podcast, you were able to listen to Becca and myself as we discussed together how to define a boundary. Today, we will be delving in a bit deeper into the conversation on boundaries. But before we start with Renee, I want to remind everyone to check our show notes to find links and other resources that we mentioned during today's podcast. So we have had a lot of different things going on in the office here in the last few weeks since the last podcast that was launched. Or the last podcast that was released, I should say. And we've had several groups been going on, and we've had some good attendance. We have another group at the time of this recording that'll be starting next week. But we were kind of talking before this show today and how, and one of the groups in particular, it's been so good to be invited in this space with the ladies. I'm part of this group, and so it's good to be able to hear their authenticity and to be able to hear where they're at and the journey that they're taking, and they're just so willing to walk into those hard spaces, and that's a necessary part of the healing. But some of the things I think that's been coming up consistently is the need to know what a boundary is. Even though this group that we're doing isn't about boundaries, the idea or the topic of boundaries comes up. So when we talk about this today with boundaries, I would just challenge people to be thinking about that boundaries isn't something that's just something that some people need. It is so important because without them, it affects our relationships.
And the thing about the ladies in that group is, nobody sat down and said, we're not going to let you have boundaries. But that was what they lived. That was what they learned, that we don't do boundaries, right? You can't say no. Mm-hmm. There's so much trauma in there, so much of if I tell you to do it, you do it. I don't care how uncomfortable you are, if it's painful or embarrassing, And so I think learning boundaries for ladies who have been in those situations is harder.
Yeah, absolutely.
But also more important, right? Because boundaries keep us safe. And so to empower women with a sense of safety when a lot of the ladies, especially in that group, they haven't known
absolutely
safety.
Yeah. And I think that's really key for our listeners too, as they're listening to this. If that is your story and you've been through some type of trauma or a really hard place, I would just encourage you to be gentle with yourself as you're listening to this. You might need to pause this, listen to it a little bit at a time, take it in small chunks. That's okay. You don't have to just push through and just say, I got to get this done, because it may be really hard to hear.
Yeah. And I always get concerned about, just do the things, the behavioral modifications. That's not where healing lies primarily. You can't just do the things and make everything right. So, because that happens, the beating yourself up, self-contempt, the guilt, the shame, if you can't, you can't do the things to set the boundaries. But yeah, definitely having grace with yourself to understand this is really hard. It's important, and I want to learn and I want to grow, but also it's really hard. And that's okay.
Excuse me. Yeah, it is definitely, it is okay that it's maybe a scary place or a hard place for you, but I think my encouragement is just to keep doing the work, keep showing up, keep pressing in, to not be afraid that, to not let that fear, that overwhelming, this is a hard place, stop you from receiving the help that you need or taking those next steps. And I'll get personal for just a minute and say that I remember when I was in that space, my natural tendency is just to run, to flee, to hide. And so when those spaces got hard, it was so incredibly difficult to stay present. Whether it was physically present, mentally present, disassociate whatever that was, because I did all the things. It was learning and how to stay physically present so I could process through that. But there's also that level of giving myself grace in that, and I had to learn all of those things. And so I just want to say to our listeners that if that's where you're at, just please be gentle with yourself. It's okay. There's no time. This is not a time limit. I have to get this done in so many weeks or months or whatever. We're all in a different time of how that's going to take, a different journey.
Yeah. Of course, in the Boundaries book by Cloud and Townsend, they talk about the small no's, right? So learning how to say no and maybe less weighty or less intimidating situations. Just beginning to learn that no is an option. No is a full sentence.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. So just learning that's where you start.
Yeah. And that's huge because, again, if you've been in a place where that hasn't been a place where you've been allowed to say no, just practicing those small no's can feel huge.
Oh, yeah. Giving yourself permission to say no.
Yeah, it can feel almost like you're conquering a mountain the first time you say no to somebody. One of the ways that I always challenge clients to start practicing no is just like if you go out to eat and maybe the waitress comes back and says, "Hey, you want bread?" Say no. You're not being mean or anything like that, but sometimes just even that can be hard for somebody who's always been that not able to set that line, like, no, I don't want bread, And it could feel kind of like, oh, look, I said no, and nothing happened. Like they just listened.
Yeah. I didn't get any more bread.
Right.
She didn't come back.
Yeah, she didn't come back and force bread on me.
She didn't, yeah.
She didn't come back and bring bread and make me eat it. It was somebody accepted that. And then being able to have that experience of people accepting your no builds that resiliency to where I can do this. Yeah. So that kind of reminds me, as you're talking about that, those are some of the things that we talked about last time with Becca, with that power of being able to just say no. We also talked about with her, we started to define boundaries, right? And like what is a boundary and what isn't a boundary. Because if we can use the word boundary, but if we don't know what it is, because I'm sure you've seen that where people say the word boundary, but it's not.
A lot of times in this conversation, you get into the conversation about fences and walls, right? Like it's not to just stonewall somebody, to shut them out, to hide from them. It is a fence, and I think Becca talked a little bit about that, the fence with the gate.
Yes.
And defining what is me and what is not me.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
And again, when you've been in abusive situations, especially childhood abuse, there is no distinction between me and other.
Yeah. Because it's all kind of entangled or enmeshed together. There's a word that we use in the counseling where we enmesh. And so we don't understand that separateness. And there's a lot of that desire of it's my responsibility to make sure that whatever they need, want, request, demand is my job to fix.
And of course, victimization, right? Where it's not like when you're older, when you're an adult, you have internalized that sometimes, a lot of times. But where that starts is the other person encroaching was the word I think you guys talked about last time. They just come into your space. They don't care if you shut the door and say, I want to be alone. Yeah. They just find their way in and just bulldoze you.
Yep. Yeah. Like this, I'm going to do what I want so I can get what I require of you, whether you want to or not.
Feel so helpless.
For sure. And that makes it that creates a cycle in yourself even like, oh, this is what I'm supposed to do. This is what's required of me from all people. And so then that's where those boundary lines get to be really broken or soft. And it becomes really hard. So, as we talked about what's me and what's not me, we also talked about, well, what's within those boundaries? What are the things that I am responsible for? So we talked about things such as feelings and attitudes are, like our thoughts. Those are things that are mine. Like,
and of course, behaviors.
Yeah. Yeah. Because we can't, I think this is said a lot in culture. Well, you might hear somebody say, well, I couldn't help that. They made me do that.
Yeah.
Or they made me feel that way. Or they made me speak that.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not true.
Right. Recognizing.
We're in control of our own selves.
Right.
That's part of our autonomy, our own self boundary.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sometimes I talk about in counseling the kind of the ball, like a tennis ball or or volleyball, right? The back and forth, right? So somebody does something, that ball comes into my space, and yes, it affects me. I have to figure out where it is and how I'm going to respond to it.
Yeah,
but it's on my side of the
Yes.
net, my side of the fence.
Yeah.
I get to choose. And sometimes we react quickly. Everything happens quickly in our minds, and it takes time to practice and learn.
It does.
How to respond. Yeah.
And I think that's the key word that you just said is it takes time to practice. There's an intentionality, there's a practice, there's a how do I learn this new skill? Because what you've been doing up to this point, you've been practicing, you just don't realize it.
Right.
And so to learn a new skill, it's going to take time to do that. Right. So I think that's the other thing to recognize is that you might start to do this boundary thing as we're talking about, right? And they're like, well, I tried boundaries and it doesn't work. Well, it's just like it took you a long time to learn how to be where you're at today. It's going to take a time.
It's a skill.
Yeah, that you had to build. I guess if we were to think of a skill, you didn't just wake up one day and go, I think I'm going to run a bike today. Like the first time and you were successful and you just took, maybe you did. It's rare, but most people don't do that. They have to have somebody help them along the way, and then they get a little bit more confidence. They get better and better and better. They don't just go from never riding a bike to now they're what is it, the Tour de France? Yeah, that they just, I just did that the next day. It just doesn't, typically. Right? And it's just the same thing with our emotional, building that emotional muscle and learning boundaries. It's going to take time. So we also talked a little bit about how we kind of see the lack of boundaries playing out in ourselves, how that we can, what we would call symptoms. Come out in the individual when there aren't those boundaries. And so some of those things can include quite a variety of responses. So we might see somebody with depression or anxiety. What are some other ones that you have seen when you're working with people?
Resentment is a big one. Rage. Kind of those tendencies to try to control environments or control people. Comes out in lots of different ways.
Yeah, we want to, because the control, the reason a lot of times it feels safe.
Right.
So we want to control because it feels safer because everything else feels chaotic or unsafe. So we got to find a way to bring that safety in. So there is something in the air today I'm just going to say, because I think we both keep clearing our throats. So if somebody's listening, I apologize, as we have had a lot of, especially me, where we keep having to clear our throats. So hopefully that's not coming across too much. But I think we've had a sudden shift in the temperature here. And so I think it's affecting, because I don't know about you, but I'm having a hard time today. So I apologize for those listening, because you're going to hear us clear our voice a lot. But, so some of the things that we need to also be talking about is how do we come aware of when those boundaries have been pushed. Sometimes our bodies will give us cues, if you will, and help us to know what's happening.
We have boundaries we don't know we have.
Yeah.
We haven't chosen. But we have that internal sense that there's something not right.
Yeah.
So being able to identify that and figure out, okay, what just happened outside of me, what happened inside of me, and slowing down to, not in the moment, but as you reflect, right, to figure out what just happened and why did it happen, and now what do I need to do?
Yeah, for sure, because I think that's one of the things I'm always just amazed at, how God gave our bodies this way, this ability to let us know what's going on within it. So, like, something will happen, and that's something I try to wrestle through with clients is like, what is your body telling you? What's kind of the indicators giving you? A lot of times we recognize the indicator, and it's usually not the first indicator that happens. And so I always challenge people, it's like, really pay attention to your body. Like, what is it doing? Like, it took me a while to identify my own body cues and what it does and when it's doing those things. And because I think what happens a lot of times is they become so normalized to us that we just go, we don't even know that it's happening. Yeah. And so we don't even recognize it as a cue. So we have to really kind of tune into our own self so we can start seeing that and then start using that as a tool to help us go, okay, something's happening. We got to address it. We need to figure out what's happening here. Is it a boundary issue? What's going on? And how do I make this shift or this change?
And you're right. And that's something that God has given us. And I think about, if you think about property, we use a lot of property analogies and fences and yard and all of that. If you think about having an alarm system for your property, your house, if somebody comes onto your property or opens your door and they're not supposed to be there, well, your alarms are going to go off, right? And so it's very similar when somebody crosses your personal boundary and there's alarms are going off, paying attention, not shutting it down, but paying attention. Why are the alarms going off? Yeah. And sometimes it's a mistrigger, right? It's a misfire, if you will, where your alarms are going off based on it's a trigger from something in your past. So it's not, it's like a false alarm, right? Yeah. We've all had that. Or, say this and embarrass my husband, I guess, if anybody listens and, that every time he cooks, he sets off the smoke alarm.
Oh, yeah. That happens in a lot of houses, though, because some are so sensitive, I think is what it's oversensitivity of the smoke alarm.
Is there a fire?
Yeah.
No. Does it sound like our house is blazing? Yes.
We've had this. Right? We have the same issue at our house, especially at our old house. The smoke detector was too close to the stove, and so we'd have those false alarms all the time.
Right.
And it sounded like, and it felt like there was an emergency, but there wasn't.
Right. And so that can happen, right? And so then, I know at our house, recognizing, okay, this happens a lot when we cook. So, but there's not really a fire. So what do we need to do so those alarms don't go off? Right? Turning on the fan, opening the door, turning the temperature down, whatever, right?
Yeah. What do we have to do? Yeah.
But there are lots of parallels to that when you think about boundaries and relationships and how to take care of yourself and heal from, being abused or traumatized.
Yeah.
And I think it's,
Yeah, as you were talking, I love how you brought that in of how it's really a good indicator, things we could correlate back to us in the boundary world. But then I was also thinking about how if you were to live in a house where the smoke alarm was going off every day, eventually you would be like, it's just there. It's just background noise. We wouldn't hear it. We would even ignore it.
That's right.
But it's the same thing that when we've been in that world of no boundaries or lack of boundaries, it's just like that smoke alarm that's going off, and we're just doing life. And so it takes time to recalibrate so we can then hear the alarm going off again.
Right.
Because if you're in that environment constantly, if you were in that house where the smoke alarm is going off constantly, you would have to recalibrate, readjust. Because like somebody might show up at your house and be like, hey, Renee, your smoke alarm's going off. You'd be like, what are you talking about?
Right.
Like, I don't hear anything. Like listen.
Right.
Like, don't you hear it? And they'd have to help you, like point it out maybe. And to the other person, it's like, duh, kind
obvious,
of for obvious, and not to be insulting, but it feels really obvious to the person. But for you, that's in it because it's every day, it's constant. You just don't even hear it anymore. It
blends into the background.
Yeah, and I think we can think of things that are less like maybe hard for us to relate to. That I think people can understand. But there's things that we all have in our lives that become like kind of that annoying background noise, like. You can think of like a fan that constantly goes or something, and after a while, you just don't even hear it,
Well, you know what happens a lot of times is when it's off, then it's almost, it's like that deafening silence.
Yeah, it's like, something's missing.
Yeah.
And it's almost like we crave it, even though we don't need it.
It's uncomfortable.
Or it's not good for us. Yeah, it's uncomfortable not to have the thing that's causing the difficulty.
Right. So is there a danger? Is there a threat in these different scenarios? No, not necessarily. But if the alarms are going off, there is something that needs to be done. We need to stop and think, okay, why are the alarms going off and what do I need to do?
Yeah.
Whether it's a misfire or, or not, the alarm's going off. So So we gotta
Yeah.
respond to that.
For sure.
And the more we're aware of those reactions, those things happening inside us, our thoughts, our feelings, the more control we have
Yeah.
over
Yeah.
the sirens.
And control in a good way.
Alarms. Absolutely.
Not control in the way that we're trying to, because control can be both a positive and a negative.
Right.
Because we talked about that a little bit ago about how control was a symptom. But now we're talking about how to have control. And so I want our audience to hear that control can be a good skill, but we have to use it well.
Right. Yes. And I'm talking in terms of, that's a good distinction. I appreciate that. In terms of growing up with abuse and things being out of control, not having control, feeling, helpless and hopeless, and at that point needing to gain a sense of control over your own personhood, right? What's within your boundaries,
Yes.
your thoughts, your feelings, your body. That's health, right? That's what we want. We're not trying to control others. The idea is to control self.
Yes, and that's a great explanation of the differentiation, because I think, especially when you're working that trauma, that word just control can feel confusing.
It can.
Like you want me to have control, but you don't want me to have control.
Right.
And so to help people wrestle through that, so you can go, okay, I see the difference now. Control of self is valuable. Not allowing others to control me, but me to have that control is what is necessary and important.
Yeah. Because when you think of the different symptoms or things that we were just talking about that come up, I mean, that's a lot of what's going on. We feel maybe anxiety, we feel nervous, we feel worried because someone has taught us that if we don't do a certain thing, we should feel that. It's our responsibility when it may or may not be. And so we have to relearn, is that really my responsibility or isn't it?
Right.
Yeah.
So as we've been talking about that differentiation of control versus control of self and control of others controlling us or controlling our environment, and trying to learn about how we need to pitch the cues in our body, and then all those things are so important. But then we need to really be thinking about what is our responsibility versus what is someone else's. Because if we can't differentiate that, and we've kind of tapped on that a little bit today, is if we can't differentiate between what's mine and what's theirs, that gets really confusing. And that can be, I think, also a really hard thing to start wrestling through when you're trying to figure out what your boundary is, because it's, again, we go back to that enmeshment or entanglement of, well, everything's my responsibility. Because if you've been, again, we go back to that trauma or really hard environment, abuse background that you might have been in, if that's your story, you may feel like everything is your job to take care of.
Your responsibility.
That's been the message that's probably been given to you.
So often it's the responsibility of how other people feel, right? Which is so daunting. If I have to be responsible for how you feel, boy, talk about anxiety and depression.
Right, because how can you then control or manage how other people are feeling, especially if their feelings are erratic?
Yeah.
Because usually the person who is supposing onto you or putting onto you their feelings, they aren't a good manager of their own.
Exactly.
And so they're putting onto you chaotic.
That's a reaction.
Yeah.
On their part.
Right.
Yeah.
And so if you have chaotic feelings being pushed onto you.
Right. Now, on a little bit more of a milder note, not just something that's, I think, a life stage thing, and I can relate to in the stage of life I'm in, is, in terms of what's my responsibility and what's the other person's responsibility, is raising kids.
Yes.
Because when they're little, everything about them is your responsibility. Yeah. And as they grow and change, you gradually give them more responsibility until...
Or we should.
And healthy,
yes,
and healthy
boundaries,
the
of course, yes.
The ideal of raising, raising a child is that you gradually give them those
I
responsibilities.
think if we go back to Becca's example of the yard, it's almost like their yard starts out really small.
Yeah.
And like as they get older and they grow in maturity, we want their yard, their boundary line to get a little bit wider. Because if we don't give that to them, then we're the ones who are trying to control too much.
Well, they live on our property, right?
Yeah, right.
Both like literally, but
Yeah.
also in terms of that boundary, right? They're in our house. They're part of us.
Yeah.
And gradually they walk towards that gate. And, and as they gain some independence, even in adolescence, and they leave, right? And they come back, right? And they experience other people and other environments. And then, over time, that's more and more, and you're less and less responsible.
Yeah. And then I think then the next transition, as we're kind of moving on that, is that going from a child to an adult.
Right.
Of your adult child is what I would call it.
Exactly.
Call them then. And that can be a really hard boundary shift for parents and children. And, if you read the Cloud and Townsend book, they talk a little bit, they have a story that actually talks about that.
Right.
Where,
of course, the whole book, Boundaries with Children. So.
Yeah, they do have that.
Or Boundaries
but
with
in
Kids.
this book in particular, there's a story that I'm remembering how a couple comes to, I think it's Dr. Cloud in the book, and talks about this whole scenario of how the kid just isn't listening, and the kid has all these issues. And Dr. Cloud comes back and says, well, no, your son doesn't have a problem. And they're like shocked. Like, what do you mean our son doesn't have a problem? He's doing all these bad behaviors. And it's like, no, you have the problem because you have no boundaries. And because you're trying to still manage everything for him. You're not allowing him to be an adult. And so that's where that, as they go on, if we don't learn how to shift those boundaries, we're not creating responsible adults.
Right. But it's hard to transition
It
responsibility.
Is. Oh, my goodness. It's so hard. Well, and I think that's why we as a culture struggle with that, because it's that – because I think it feels – I don't know, like we're caring well when we're doing all the things, especially for our kids.
Right.
And they're growing up.
It's like servanthood.
And, So I'm doing what I need to do to care for my kids. They're hurting. They're, they couldn't pay their bills this month, so I paid all their bills for them. It feels caring. And it's really hard to not do all the things that we might feel like we need to do.
Really, it disables and weakens. And again, I think you and Becca were talking about that last time too a little bit.
Yeah, because when we take away, we're not empowering them to be and to learn and to grow. Yeah, so that's really good for us to really wrestle through some of those things of why we can't, or why we should set good and healthy boundaries with each other. So I think we alluded to this a minute ago, is that sometimes it's really hard to be able to set boundaries with others, though, because maybe the people in your life might have a hard time even recognizing that there is a boundary issue. So you might say, hey, something's not right here, and you're trying to learn how to set those boundaries, but maybe those around you get pushback from. And
or they leave. They abandon you, right?
Yeah.
They neglect you. You're not part of something. That can be terrifying.
Terrifying. And it could make you want to not hold that boundary. Absolutely.
Right. Because what's more important? That boundary or just not being alone?
Yeah. And sometimes, and that's that can be hard to wrestle through. And there's that fear element comes in. If I do this, I may be alone forever. And I think that word forever can feel really big. But we have to wrestle through again. We have to filter all those thoughts and feelings through truth. Because while we might feel that, the question I would just challenge is that true? And that's really important for us to do, especially as we're learning to set those boundaries.
Yeah. And actually, it might be true.
It might be.
But it also might be a relationship, as hard as it is and as hard as it sounds, a relationship that we need to let go of that's not good for us.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's hard to understand, too.
It is, because if you're setting boundaries consistently and you're doing them well, and that person leaves because they can't respect your no or respect your boundary, then that's when we have to ask ourselves a good question, which is this a good and healthy relationship for me? Is this something because if if they want to come into that space with you and learn and grow with you, that's
Right.
a different response than
Absolutely.
I can't be around you because you're learning how to set boundaries. I can't do that with you.
Mm-hmm.
Or they get angry and they push away, or they,
Yeah.
abandon you.
Mm-hmm.
So being able to see the difference is important.
Mm-hmm. So not to keep going back to the kid thing, but I was just thinking how, if our kids go through hard times or something happens and they want to come back and they want to stay with us, right?
Yeah.
That this is, I think, a really good example of those boundaries, because you're loving, so you want to help them out. And I was talking, to somebody this week who was talking a lot about that, right? Like, you're welcome to come into my home.
Mm-hmm.
I'll put a roof over your head. You have someplace to sleep. I'll feed you.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't allow drinking, and I don't allow drugs, and I don't allow smoking. And, I have thoughts and feelings about what kind of language you should use, right? And so these are my boundaries. You can do what you want. But, if you can live in that, absolutely, come on.
Right.
Right? And to some people that feels mean or cruel.
Right,
but that's,
right.
I think, a good example of having that boundary.
Yeah.
Where it's like, okay, these are the rules, these are the boundaries. I'm not controlling you because I'm not telling you have to do these things, but there is a condition. If you're going to be in my house, then these things are necessary.
This is the boundary, the limit that I set with being here. And I think for those who can't accept those boundaries, sometimes we'll see that they might give pushback. They might deny what you're saying as legitimate or real.
Right. Well, and you get the guilt trips, right?
Yeah.
I can't believe you would let me sleep, on the street or leave me without a place to go.
Yeah, how dare you?
Right.
If you cared about me enough.
That's right.
Yeah. And so they try, it's that blaming others, that blame shifting. Well, now I'm going to be homeless and it's all your fault.
Right.
But is it? Yeah. It's there. It comes back to, because you, like you said, you're setting that boundary line. And so they get to choose.
Have a choice,
yeah, they get to choose. I can go within this boundary system that's been set up, or I can go find another place to live, or I can go be homeless.
Right.
Just because they don't want to live within your boundary doesn't mean there's not other options.
Right.
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean that they've been neglected either.
No, that's true. It doesn't. But to the person who can't accept boundaries, that may be what you hear from them is, you don't care enough about me. You should do more to take care of me. And that's then you taking on their responsibility. That's that 2 and 4 that we talked about.
Yeah.
With the boundaries is, are you responsible to them or for them? And, you can't do everything for them.
But those are some of the things, the obstacles, right, to setting boundaries.
Yeah, for sure. So when there are issues with our boundaries, a lot of times there are symptoms that we see that come out in the relationships or in the individual. I think some of the things we've kind of touched on, so we've touched on a lot of these already. And I think the one that kind of keeps coming back in my mind from our conversation today is for the individual that is trying to set the boundary, there might be a lot of worry and anxiety that comes up from them. Yeah. It can feel really heavy. They might even feel left out, defeated. Like the word you used earlier was abandoned.
Yeah.
So all those things could come up. But I think for the person that may not appreciate, value, accept the boundary, there might be some anger that could come up. And there could be anger on the other side, too. I think there could be anger on both sides. Like anger when you realize how much your boundary has been overstepped.
Oh, yeah.
And then anger can come from the person that you're now setting the boundary towards.
Yep.
Yeah, that can, I know, I just in here thinking about that word, about that feeling of anger. It can be, I don't know, scary for a lot of people, especially again. And I think we keep going back at least I feel like we keep going back to the trauma side because that's so much of what we do here.
Right.
It's not that we want people to only hear this from a trauma perspective, but that's so much of what we work with. And so if you've been brought up in that environment where you've had people who have used anger as a weapon or a tool, when you start to set a boundary and someone gets angry, it can, man, it's a hard, that's a hard one.
Well, yeah, something switches in our brain where it becomes life and death.
Yeah.
And so boundaries kind of, the idea, it becomes kind of this lofty ideal, and it's not practical. And at that point, it's like survive or don't survive.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And so that's where I think it's really good for, if you're in that space, to have somebody to kind of help you process through that, because that anger that's coming at you, if you can have those safety guidelines, those boundaries of how to take care of you in that space, you can still do boundaries well and learn how to differentiate from when do I need to do something to change my behavior to fix their anger.
Right.
And that's sometimes where we need that assistance to do that.
And being able to process that, with a good counselor, therapist, as a therapist, I would say, so what happened for you when you said this, you did this, the person became angry?
Yeah.
Right? So again, making people aware of what's happening in their bodies, what are they doing, the bells, the whistles, the sirens that are going off, and going into, okay, why, and figuring out what's happening and what options you have.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good, because we do need to know. I mean, because I think that goes all back to equipping and knowing how we can respond. Because if we don't have our tools, we talk about this often, is we don't have the tools in our toolbox, as they say, then you don't know where to pull that from to where you can continue to move forward. And that's necessary so you can continue to have that good healing process.
Right.
Yep. Some other things that can kind of happen as we're kind of working through our symptoms that can indicate boundary problems is a person might feel really disorganized or really overwhelmed, kind of that taking on of a lot of things for themselves. And so they might feel like they have the weight of the world on their shoulders.
Right. They're in that reactive space. I talk a lot with clients about reacting versus responding. So reacting is like what we do in the moment because we've been conditioned a certain way, or, where responding is that slowing down and being aware of what's happening, right?
Yeah.
And so that's where it pivots. That's where you go from being out of control, being disorganized, to being aware and being able to say, okay, I think I need a boundary here.
Yeah. 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 One of the things that I like to, because I think it's important for us to, if we haven't been able to know how to do boundaries, is how to verbalize what we need. And that's kind of, because I think when you've been in that space of not being able to set a boundary well or know how to even recognize a boundary, sometimes it's just helpful to be able to say out loud when you're in that space of just to say, man, I'm feeling really overwhelmed. Just to acknowledge that verbally. Yeah. That can be huge because you've never maybe had permission or space to do that. And I think for somebody when they do that for the first time, it feels really awkward. Like, you want me to say out loud, I feel overwhelmed? Like, yeah, because you need to acknowledge it. You need to hear it from yourself.
Yeah, it gives you that pause. Yeah, and if somebody's, a safe person and they don't understand that they've triggered you, you know, and you say, I'm feeling overwhelmed, well, then they're going to respect that. And they're going to probably back down or slow down.
Right.
A lot of times I'll say, if somebody crosses a boundary, I'll say, that's not okay. Whoa. Yeah. Right? Yeah, sometimes I'll be like, whoa, hold on.
What just happened? Yeah.
Yeah. That's not okay. Right? I don't know. Can you think of ways that you do that?
I will say to people that I will do that. Like, I'm feeling overwhelmed, or I feel like like sometimes I've gotten really good about saying, I know I need to take a break.
Yep.
Because in the past, I wouldn't tell anybody. I would just keep my head down. I would do all the things. And I would just keep pushing through because that's what you do.
Which is so great, that separation, because what you did is you just verbalized the separation between me and them. I need to take a break.
Yeah. It's not
the blaming. It's not,
no.
I can't believe what you're doing to me. I need you to go away.
Yep.
It's, I need to take a break.
Yep.
Yep.
And for me, that used to bring up shame.
Yep.
Like, oh, I need to take a break, so I'm not good enough.
Yep.
Like, I need to do more, try harder.
I should be able to stay in the conversation.
Yeah. I shouldn't have to tell people that I'm feeling overwhelmed or whatever because that's bad. I'm bad. And I had to learn that it wasn't about me being bad. It was about me knowing this is as far as I can go in this moment. And that's okay. And it's okay to say, I need to take a break.
Right.
I need to. And for me, I've gotten better about even defining what that looks like. A break might be, I just need to walk away for a minute. But sometimes I just need to, like, leave.
Put a pin in it. Right?
Yeah, like, I might need to, like, go stay somewhere in another city for a little while and be alone because I'm definitely refreshed by isolation. And so I think as we get to know ourselves, those boundaries that we set and the things that we do to care for ourselves will shift. And you'll see a shift in yourself as well.
And that goes back to the idea of self-control, right? So we're kind of dipping back through some of the things we've been talking about during this time of, for you to recognize, I need to take a break. Well, why do you need to take a break? Why are you feeling overwhelmed? You feel yourself getting on the verge of reacting. And maybe that's yelling. Maybe that's fighting. Maybe that's saying things you don't mean, right?
Yeah.
Catching yourself, that's the self-control, right? Catching yourself and saying, I don't want to react like that. And so I need a break.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, because when we aren't recognizing what our limits or boundaries are, we can't be our best self.
That's right.
And we're going to do all the things you just said. And we all have different responses. So that's the other thing I want people to hear is we're talking about just some of the ways that we respond or some of the ways that we react. And so just because this isn't you doesn't mean that there's not something else that's you. And so, you listed a bunch, and some of the things that you listed as far as behaviors aren't the ways that I behave necessarily. But I do know that I have things that I definitely do if I don't take care of myself.
Right.
It's not pretty.
Right.
I don't become a pretty, like my behavior is not pleasant and pretty to be around if I don't do what I need to do to set those limits and boundaries. So as we've talked about, there's so many different symptoms that can happen or things that come out as we're identifying boundary issues that we might have. And we have it. There's so many more that we could talk about. This is not an all-inclusive list. If it's something that you're just wanting to know about, I think it'd be helpful if we include this list in our show notes. We'll make a post and we'll put it on our website so people can go and see like what are the symptoms, what are some things we can look at. So I'll make sure that's on our website so you can go to our show notes and we'll direct you to that because I just as we're talking through it, I'm thinking, man, people might be wondering, well, I don't hear myself in that. Maybe there's something that I might hear myself in. I will just caution people to say that just when you go there, this isn't a diagnostic tool by any stretch of the imagination.
No.
It's just things for you to be looking at for reference and information because we want to equip you. But I think as we're, so I think that'll be a really hopefully helpful thing for you. But also you can get the Boundaries book and just start reading through that.
Oh, yeah.
Which
It's a great resource.
We'll definitely link that in the show notes for people to go and purchase that book and get that and start reading through that. I think Renee mentioned before there's Boundaries, this Boundaries book, which if you're watching us on video, you'll see the book. It's just a general boundaries book on how to, I think the subtitle is when to say yes and when to say no or how, And so it's boundaries for all aspects. And then there's boundaries for teens, boundaries for
kids, boundaries in marriage, boundaries face-to-face. That's a fun one.
There's all kinds of boundaries books. But this is the one I would say you would start with. So we'll link that in the show notes for those who want to purchase this book and can go and just start reading through it because it is such a good resource. And if you don't want to purchase the book, you can. I think they also have it like on Audible, where you can just listen to it. So if you're a person who likes to listen to the book, you can go to different platforms like that or like your Library One or, there's all kinds of options. So, as we're kind of coming to a close for today, we just really want to talk about what can we do, what can you do with this information and, how can it be helpful for you? I'd say one of the things that I want you to really just be thinking about for those that are listening is to simply be aware. Start being aware that this is something that you need. Boundaries are necessary. They are, for many, I would even say urgent to practice. We've talked a lot about our body today and paying attention to the symptoms.
Yeah, and I think part of being aware, too, is knowing your story, because a lot of these things are passed down generationally.
Yes.
So being aware of your story, where you come from, what patterns you saw in the generation before you or before that, even to start to explore, what you saw, what you experienced, what you learned, and how that feels, within you, right? How does that,
absolutely.
Yeah.
That's really, because all that kind of ties together. So we want to make sure how those pieces connect. Because I think the other value of knowing that story is we want to break those generational cycles so you're not inadvertently passing it on to your kids or someone else in your family. And so knowing your story is important so you can move forward and healing.
Yeah, and being aware of, how do I know I need to set a boundary? Okay, well, is there a moment when you feel taken advantage of? Is there a moment where you feel like you don't have a say or have control, or people are trying to tell you what to do or how to do it? So even I think doing a journaling exercise in a day's time of, was there a time when I felt overlooked? I mean, just being aware of those moments where you're like, hey, this thing happened and that didn't feel good.
Yeah. Absolutely. So I think those are all the things that we can do, because through those processes, through journaling, through learning our story, we're going to learn our own patterns of behavior. And when we learn our own patterns, then we're able to start making those shifts.
Right.
And so it's so important as we continue this conversation on boundaries. This is going to be our last podcast on boundaries. If you've been listening to us, we're still just scratching the surface for you to learn about boundaries. And as a reminder, in the next couple of months, we'll be releasing our classes on demand, which will help you kind of delve deeper into the topic of boundaries. So when those are released, pay attention. We'll pay attention to our website, and we'll post those on there, and on our social media. And if you're not following us on all those places, please follow us on social media: YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, all the places we're there, because we'd love for you to follow us. And then, of course, subscribe to this channel, and so you can be notified whenever new podcasts are released. So, but thank you, Renee, for being with us today and
for having me.
Yeah, having us talk about boundaries and just continue this conversation. It's been good. I appreciate it. Yeah. So as I mentioned earlier, if you've missed any of our previous podcasts, please check them out. Seeking Healing, Finding Hope. And in the meantime, if you would like to learn more about us, you go to our website, which is peacerestored.net. And don't forget to check out our show notes, where you'll be able to find the links, additional content, and a few video links as well. We are working on an exciting project, as I mentioned, that will be released in the next few months with our classes on demand. And this will be an option to learn more and to dive deeper into your healing journey, all from the comfort of your home. Make sure to be watching for the announcement of the release date. As we wrap up our discussion today, make sure to stay tuned as we begin to share with you practical ways where you too can seek healing and find hope. Join us on our next podcast, where we will continue to discuss mental health and faith. So come back next time for transformation, growth, and power. This is Peace Restored.